Of course. Well, we're grateful that you're here and we're grateful to talk about this topic. I want to start real basic here because although I think most people understand that stress impacts your immune system, when we want to boost our immune system, we don't often talk about that. So, can you tell us why it really is so essential for us to address the stress if we want to boost our immune system and have overall better health?
Yeah, and you're right. People don't understand how directly stress affects our bodies and affects every single organ system. So, our digestive system, our circulatory system, our whole nervous system, all these things are affected by stress, and not a little bit, a lot. I often hook people up at my live workshops or if I'm doing a research study to EEGs. And we measure their brain function. We can see the profile of neurological signaling in their brains. And stressed people have radically different signaling. And then when they tap, their signaling changes dramatically in a few seconds. And so stress is affecting all these organ systems and it's compromising them. Generally speaking, when you have a rise in stress, then you have a lowering of all kinds of other things, digestion, immunity, all those basic bodily functions crash when you're stressed. And the more stressed you are, the more they crash. So there's an inverse relationship between stress and overall health. When you tap and you lower your stress, then automatically all kinds of beneficial neurotransmitters, hormones like DHEA, like serotonin, like dopamine, all of those things rise as your stress levels drop. So there's an inverse proportion relationship, and the effects are pervasive throughout your body, and the changes when you're stressed are dramatic.
I'm so happy that you bring that up because when people hear about tapping and they hear that you can use it for fear of public speaking, but then you can also use it for headaches, I think sometimes they're like, I don't get it. I don't get how does it work for so many things? And you're explaining to us perfectly why. What's really happening is as we lower stress, our body can function better. And I think the reason tapping has spread all around the world so quickly is because people are having real physical experiences, real physical changes, and it all has to do with that stress. So I'm so happy that you made it so clear for us.
I remember when a friend of mine who was a Gestalt therapist told me about tapping in 2000. And he told me that, oh, I'm treating people who have PTSD. And I work with athletes using this as well, and people with phobias and anxiety and depression. I was like, there's no way this could be a one size fits all therapy because we know from medicine and diagnosis that, first of all, you diagnose your condition precisely. Is it depression? Is it a phobia? Is it PTSD? And then once you have the correct diagnosis, you then get a treatment for that diagnosis. And so our psychological system is broken into diagnostic categories. And so we're used to thinking in terms of a precise diagnosis and then a precise remedy. And that, so I didn't believe him at all. I thought this EFT thing got to be nonsense because there's no way one therapy can work for all of those different things. So I was really skeptical when I heard about it at first. And then I came to realize later on when I was studying cortisol, people's levels of cortisol, that it doesn't matter whether you're stressed because of public speaking or sports performance or a bad experience in childhood or a war you were involved in or domestic violence, whatever it might be, all of those things are stress. And so psychologically, we can categorize them into a lot of different pigeonholes, but biologically, all your body gets is the message that something's wrong. I need to go to fight or flight. And it doesn't matter whether that message is coming to you because you are facing an opposing tennis match, or you're facing a difficult challenge at work, or you have a bad performance review, or you got beaten by a thug. I mean, whatever the issues that's going on there, all of it's producing stress biologically in your body. And that biological response is very, very similar regardless of the source of the insult. And so that is why EFT works on so many different conditions. It's because it's affecting the stress component of that. It's also why EFT doesn't work equally well on everything. EFT works better on some things than others. And that's because some things have more of a stress component and others have less of a stress component. So it really explains a lot about EFT and the way it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned in the beginning, you have done so much great work when it comes to research, and that has had a huge effect on this field. The reason that tapping is now approved by the VA is because of these research studies. Can you tell us about some of these studies and any of those studies that particularly relate to immune system and our health?
Yeah, and so the earlier studies that we did, the first studies I was doing were of psychological change, anxiety, depression, PTSD, phobias, and so on. And so if you look at the very early studies 20 years ago, you find that there are these psychological measures and conditions. But I began to think around 2007, I began to reason to myself, if we're seeing these big shifts in anxiety and depression, and generally speaking, we were seeing in one day of tapping, we were seeing a 45% reduction in those psychological symptoms. And I said, if we're seeing that big a change in one day, surely that must be reflected in gene expression and must be reflected in stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. And so that was the basis of my first big best-selling book, The Genie in Your Genes, was arguing that EFT and other energy therapies were affecting gene expression. And there was no proof for that back then, but there was proof for these therapies affecting hormones. And I knew that if the hormone was going down, then the gene that codes that hormone must be being dialed down as well, especially the gene. So I then began to follow the biological track. I looked at things at biological markers, like things like frozen shoulder, things like pain levels, things like cortisol, and then I began to look at the analogies for biological markers that were positive. So cortisol's fine in small doses. You need a little bit of epinephrine, you need a little bit of cortisol to function and be alert. So small amounts are good. Most people, though, Jessica, are walking around with cortisol levels so high that it looks like they think and their bodies believe they're in the jungle 100,000 years ago and their predators were at every turn. And of course there aren't, but our cortisol levels are often really high and they're compromising our health. So I began to look at cortisol, very easy to measure it in your saliva. And I did one large randomized controlled trial, triple-blind study, a rigorous study, and it found that EFT dropped cortisol more than both talk therapy and also just resting. So I then moved on to looking at gene expression, and I then found that genes were changed, literally the expression of your genes, which genes are turned on, which genes are turned off, was changed by EFT. And then I began to think, now cortisol is going down. And we now know from several studies it is going down because that study was replicated. So that cortisol study showed the same thing. We know that if your stress is going down, all kinds of other things go up. For example, when cortisol goes down, a very similar molecule called DHEA goes up. That's your main cell repair hormone and your main cell communication hormone. So good things are happening in your body when you reduce stress. So I then said, what else can I measure? And one target that I measured then was called salivary immunoglobulin A. And it's a super important molecule. It's an antibody, and it binds to antigens. It binds to viruses, binds to bacteria, it binds to various other substances that can hurt us. And so our bodies use it as their front line of defense in all of our mucous membranes, in our mouths, in our gut, our noses, our eyes, anywhere where the body is exposed to the possibility of bacteria or viruses, you find immunoglobulins. And so I began to study the relationship of cortisol to immunoglobulins. And I'm getting chills as I tell you this, actually, because these numbers were absolutely astounding. So I did a 1-week study looking at people's levels of cortisol, immunoglobulins, as well as a whole bunch of other things, pain, happiness, anxiety, depression. And then we measured them again at the end of that week. They did meditation in the morning, they tapped all day, they were tapping on traumas, they were in a retreat center, so they were in a really nice environment. And we found that after a week there, their cortisol had dropped by 37%. Now, again, remember this inverse relationship between stress biochemistry and everything else. When stress goes up, all the good biochemicals go down. When stress goes down, especially through tapping, all the good biochemicals shoot up. And so when their cortisol dropped by 37% in the course of a week, their immunoglobulins, their salivary immunoglobulins, antibody that is the body's first line of defense against bacteria and viruses, that rose. Now, just take in this number, because when I read this number, when it came back from the lab, the independent lab that does all the tests for me, I was absolutely astounded. It rose by 113%, a more than doubling of antibodies, these antigens that protect you against viruses and bacteria, more than doubling in just 1 week. So again, we tap, the stress biochemistry goes down, and the beneficial biochemistry, DHEA,